The cast-iron skillet had been in Emma White Eagle's family for 4 generations. Its surface was seasoned to a deep black sheen from decades of fry bread, the only cookware her grandmother would trust for making the traditional Lakota staple. It was 1972, and Emma stood in her small kitchen on the Pine Ridge Reservation, teaching her 12-year-old daughter Sarah the exact technique, the way the dough should feel between your fingers, the sound the oil should make when it was hot enough, the golden brown color that meant perfection. Your great-grandmother made fry bread in this same pan during the hardest winters, Emma told Sarah as she shaped the dough. When the government rations were late and there was almost nothing to eat, she could take flour, lard, salt, and water, and make something that filled our bellies and lifted our spirits. This isn't just food. This is survival. This is love. What Emma didn't say, what she was only beginning to understand herself, was that she was teaching Sarah something that was already starting to disappear. The traditional foods and cooking methods that had sustained Native American families for generations were being replaced by commodity foods, fast food, and the convenience of modern American cooking. The 1,970 seconds marked a turning point, a decade when Native American kitchens were caught between worlds, trying to hold on to the old ways while the modern world pushed its way through their doors. In kitchens across Indian country during the 1,970 seconds, a quiet revolution was taking place. Or perhaps it was a quiet surrender. The traditional foods that had once defined tribal identity and connected people to their land, their seasons, and their ancestors were slowly disappearing from daily meals, replaced by white flour, sugar, canned goods, and processed foods that came in government commodity boxes. The commodity food program had started decades earlier, but by the 1,970 seconds, it had become the primary food source for many reservation families. Once a month, families would line up at distribution centers to receive their allotment. Blocks of government cheese, canned meat, powdered milk, white flour, sugar, and lard. These weren't the foods that Native people had eaten for thousands of years. These were surplus agricultural products that the government needed to distribute, and reservations became the dumping ground for America's excess. Margaret Tallbear, a Northern Cheyenne grandmother, remembered those distribution days with mixed feelings. "We were grateful for the food, Lord knows we needed it," she said in a 1985 interview. "But it felt like another way of taking our culture from us. My grandmother had taught me to gather wild turnips and chokecherries, to dry buffalo meat and make pemmican. But by the 70s, there was hardly any buffalo left, and we didn't have access to our traditional hunting grounds. So we ate what the government gave us and tried to make it taste like home." The government cheese became legendary in Native American households, 5-pound blocks of processed American cheese that had an almost indefinite shelf life. Women got creative with it, melting it into soups, slicing it for sandwiches, mixing it with commodity hamburger to make what some families called cheese meat. It wasn't traditional, but it was filling and free, and for families struggling with poverty and unemployment rates that sometimes reached 70 or 80%, that mattered more than authenticity. Julia Blackhorse, a Navajo woman living on the reservation in northern Arizona, became an expert at transforming commodity foods into meals that could feed her family of 7 children. "You learn to be creative," she explained. "The commodity flour wasn't good for making traditional Navajo kneel-down bread. It was too refined, too white. But it made decent fry bread if you knew what you were doing. The canned meat, which we called commodity beef, even though nobody was quite sure what animal it came from, could be mixed with potatoes and onions to make a stew. You did what you had to do." But even as families adapted to these new staples, the memory of traditional foods lingered like a ghost in their kitchens. Older women remembered when corn wasn't something that came in a can, but something you grew yourself, grinding it on stone metates the way their mothers and grandmothers had done. They remembered when beans were a dozen different varieties, each with its own purpose and flavor, not just the uniform pinto beans that came in the commodity bags. The 3 sisters, corn, beans, and squash, had been the foundation of agriculture for many eastern and southwestern tribes for over 1,000 years. These crops were grown together in a symbiotic relationship. The corn stalks provided support for the climbing beans, the beans fixed nitrogen in the soil to feed the corn, and the squash leaves shaded the ground to retain moisture and prevent weeds. It was sustainable agriculture perfected over centuries, but by the 1970s, fewer and fewer native families were planting traditional gardens. "Why would you spend all summer growing corn when you could get canned corn from the commodity program?" asked Thomas Running Deer, a Lakota man who watched traditional agriculture disappear from his community during the 70s. People were tired, poor, and overwhelmed. Many of the men were gone. Either they'd left the reservation looking for work, or they died young from accidents or alcohol or despair. The women who were left had to raise children alone, often without running water or electricity. Working a traditional garden plot wasn't practical anymore. It was easier to open a can. The loss of traditional agriculture meant the loss of traditional ingredients, and with them went dishes that had been made for generations. Among the Ojibwe people of the Great Lakes region, wild rice manoomin had been a sacred food for centuries. Families would spend weeks each fall harvesting it from lakes and streams, processing it by traditional methods that involved parching, hulling, and winnowing. By the 1970s, much of the wild rice harvest was being done by commercial operations, and many native families were buying it from stores if they ate it at all. My grandmother used to say that wild rice wasn't just food, it was a gift from the Creator, and harvesting it was a spiritual practice, said Rose Littlewolf, an Ojibwe elder. You had to approach the rice beds with respect, offer tobacco, take only what you needed. The whole family would go together. It was about more than eating. It was about being Ojibwe. But my children? They grew up eating minute rice from a box because I was working 2 jobs and didn't have time to prepare wild rice the traditional way. I don't blame them for not knowing the old ways. I blame the world that made the old ways impossible. Salmon had played a similar role for many Pacific Northwest tribes, not just a food source but a cultural and spiritual center. The first salmon ceremony, held when the first salmon of the season returned to the rivers to spawn, was one of the most important events of the year. The salmon would be caught, prepared in a specific ceremonial way, and shared with the community. The bones would be returned to the river to ensure the salmon would continue to return. By the 1970s, decades of overfishing, dam construction, and habitat destruction had decimated salmon runs on many rivers. Traditional fishing sites that tribes had used for thousands of years were often inaccessible, either flooded by dams or claimed by non-native commercial fishermen. Many native families in the Pacific Northwest had to buy salmon from supermarkets, farm-raised Atlantic salmon, that bore little resemblance to the wild Pacific salmon their ancestors had revered. "It broke my father's heart," remembered Daniel Riversong, a Yakima man whose family had fished the Columbia River for generations. He would go to the store and see these pale, farm-raised salmon, and he'd just shake his head. He'd buy them because we needed fish, but he'd say, "This isn't real salmon. Real salmon fight their way upstream. Real salmon have spirits. This is just meat." He was right. We'd lost something profound, and we were trying to fill that hole with something from the supermarket. The loss of traditional hunting practices also transformed Native American kitchens. For Plains tribes, buffalo had been everything: food, clothing, shelter, tools. The systematic slaughter of buffalo in the late 1800s had already devastated these cultures. But by the 1970s, buffalo meat was almost entirely absent from Native American diets. Some families might have access to beef, either commodity beef or, if they were lucky, beef from cattle ranching operations on the reservation, but it wasn't the same. "Buffalo meat is lean, rich, full of flavor," explained Henry Loneman, a Lakota elder, and one of the early advocates for buffalo restoration on reservations. "The fat is different from beef fat, healthier. And eating buffalo connected us to our history, to the time when we were free to roam the plains and hunt. When you ate buffalo, you were eating your heritage." Beef? Beef was what white ranchers raised. It filled your stomach, but it didn't feed your spirit. Traditional food preparation methods were also disappearing. Many tribes had developed sophisticated techniques for preserving meat and other foods without refrigeration. Plains tribes made pemmican dried meat pounded with fat and berries that could last for months or even years. Northwest Coast tribes smoked salmon using carefully tended fires that would burn for days. Southwestern tribes dried corn, squash, and meat in the desert sun. By the 1972nd, most native households had refrigerators and freezers, and these traditional preservation methods seemed outdated and unnecessary. Why spend days smoking fish when you could just put it in the freezer? The practical answer made sense, but something was lost in the translation. The traditional methods weren't just about preservation, they were about transformation. Smoked salmon didn't just last longer. It tasted different, better, and carried the flavor of alderwood and tradition. Cooking methods were changing too. Traditional cooking had often involved open fires, earth ovens, or specific types of cookware that had been used for generations. Many tribes made pottery for cooking, and different designs in clays created different flavors and textures. Navajo kneel-down bread was traditionally baked in the ground, wrapped in corn husks and buried in hot ashes. Pueblo peoples baked bread in outdoor adobe ovens called hornos. Modern stoves and ovens made cooking easier and faster, but they also standardized it. Food cooked on a modern electric stove tasted like food cooked on any other electric stove. The unique flavors that came from cooking in an earth oven or over a specific type of wood fire were lost. Some families tried to maintain the old ways, building outdoor ovens, cooking certain dishes only by traditional methods, but it required time, space, and knowledge that was increasingly rare. I watched my grandmother make bread in the horno, the outdoor oven, said Patricia Naranjo, a Santa Clara Pueblo woman. It took hours. You had to build the fire just right, let it burn down to coals, gauge the temperature by holding your hand inside. The bread that came out had this incredible crust, crispy and slightly smoky, and the inside was soft and perfect. I tried to learn, but I was going to school, then college, then I moved to the city for work. When I came back to the Pueblo to visit, I'd buy bread from the store like everyone else. My grandmother never said anything, but I could see the sadness in her eyes. The medicinal and spiritual aspects of traditional foods were also being forgotten. In many native cultures, certain foods weren't just nutritious, they were medicine. Specific plants and animals were eaten to treat illnesses, strengthen the body, or support spiritual practices. The knowledge of which foods had which properties had been passed down through generations, but by the 1972nd, fewer people held this knowledge. My grandmother knew every plant, said Louise Erdrich, the Ojibwe author, speaking about her own family history. She knew what to eat if you had a headache, what would help a fever, what would give you strength after childbirth. This knowledge was incredibly detailed and specific, not just eat this plant, but pick it at this time of year, prepare it this way, combine it with these other things. When she died, most of that knowledge died with her. We didn't write things down. It wasn't our way. And we were all so busy trying to make it in the modern world that we didn't think to sit down and learn everything she knew. The social aspects of traditional Native American food culture were changing too. Traditionally, food preparation and meals had been communal activities. Extended families cooked together, ate together, and shared resources. If someone had a successful hunt, the meat would be distributed throughout the community. If someone's garden produced an abundance of squash, it would be shared with neighbors and relatives. By the 1972nd, the nuclear family model that dominated white American culture was becoming more common on reservations. Families were smaller and more isolated. People ate in their own homes rather than in large communal gatherings. The economics of poverty made sharing harder when you barely had enough for your own family. You couldn't afford to feed extended relatives the way previous generations had. The commodity food program made us selfish, observed Martha Grass, a Crow elder. That sounds harsh, but it's true. We'd get our monthly allotment, and it was calculated for our immediate family, not for our cousins and aunts and uncles who might need help. If you shared too freely, your own children would go hungry. So people became protective of their food in a way that would have been unthinkable to our grandparents. It changed something fundamental about how we related to each other. Despite all these losses, many Native American families in the 1,970 fought to preserve what they could of their food traditions. Women especially became the keepers of cultural knowledge, teaching their daughters and granddaughters recipes and techniques even as the world around them changed. Fry bread became a symbol of this resistance and adaptation. It wasn't a traditional food. Native Americans didn't have wheat flour before European contact, but it had become deeply associated with Native identity by the 1,970. The story of fry bread was itself a story of survival. When tribes were forcibly relocated and given government rations that didn't include their traditional foods, they created fry bread from what they had. It was born from tragedy but became a source of pride. At powwows and gatherings throughout the 70s, fry bread was everywhere. Women would set up stands and cook it fresh, the smell of frying dough filling the air. People would eat it plain, dusted with powdered sugar, topped with honey, or turned into Indian tacos piled high with beans, meat, lettuce, tomatoes, and cheese. It wasn't health food. The combination of white flour and lard meant it was high in calories and low in nutritional value, but it was identity food. When you ate fry bread, you were participating in something native, something that connected you to your people. Fry bread is complicated, reflected Suzanne Shone Harjo, a Cheyenne and Hodulji Muskogee writer and activist, in an essay written decades later. It represents survival, but it also represents loss. It's delicious, but it's part of why Native Americans have such high rates of diabetes and heart disease. We love it, but we also know it's not good for us. That contradiction, loving something that hurts us, is very Native American. It's the story of how we've had to survive. Some families maintain traditional food practices despite the obstacles. They kept gardens using traditional varieties of corn, beans, and squash seeds that had been saved and passed down for generations. They hunted and fished when they could, using traditional methods. They gathered wild plants and seasoned dandelion greens in spring, choke cherries in summer, wild turnips in fall. "My mother refused to let the old ways die completely," said Robert Fasthorse, a Lakota man. "Even though we lived in a tiny government house with a cramped kitchen and not much money, she kept a garden. She'd walk miles to gather berries and dig turnips. She'd trade with other families some of our venison for some of their squash. She taught me and my siblings the Lakota names for all the traditional foods. She'd say, 'The government can take our land, our language, our ceremonies, but they can't take our recipes. As long as we remember how to make wajapi berry pudding and wasna pemmican, we're still Lakota.'" The 1,970 also saw the beginnings of what would become a broader Native American cultural revival movement. Organizations like the American Indian Movement, AIM, weren't just fighting for political rights. They were fighting for cultural survival, including food sovereignty. They organized community gardens, traditional food workshops, and efforts to restore traditional hunting and fishing rights. The fish-ins of the Pacific Northwest during this period were partly about legal rights, but also about cultural rights. When Native activists deliberately violated state fishing regulations to assert their treaty rights, they were fighting for more than the ability to catch salmon. They were fighting for the continuation of a way of life that centered on salmon. "We weren't just fighting for fish," explained Billy Frank Jr., a Nisqually tribal member and fishing rights activist. "We were fighting for our identity. Salmon are who we are. The ceremonies, the stories, the way we organize our year, everything revolves around the salmon runs. If we can't fish, we can't be Nisqually." So we fought, and we won some important legal victories in the 70s. But the larger battle, the battle to restore the salmon runs themselves, to heal the rivers, to bring back what was lost, that battle is still being fought. The kitchen became a battleground in this larger cultural war. Every time a native woman taught her daughter a traditional recipe, it was an act of resistance. Every time a family chose to serve traditional foods at a gathering instead of taking the easier route of Kentucky Fried Chicken or McDonald's, it was a political statement. Every time someone planted a garden with traditional seed varieties, they were fighting against cultural erasure. But the pressures against traditional foodways were immense. Poverty meant that people had to make choices based on economics rather than culture. A can of commodity beef was free. Traditional foods often required time, equipment, and knowledge that many families didn't have. Convenience foods were marketed aggressively, and by the 1970s, fast food restaurants were opening near many reservations, offering cheap, filling food that required no preparation. Television also played a role. By the 70s, most reservation homes had TV, and Native American children were growing up watching the same commercials as white American children. They saw ads for Coca-Cola, Wonder Bread, Kraft macaroni and cheese, and McDonald's. They learned to want these foods, to see them as normal and desirable. Traditional foods, by contrast, seemed old-fashioned, a reminder of poverty and the past. "My kids wanted what they saw on TV," admitted Sarah Whitman, a Hopi mother of 5. "They'd see kids in commercials eating Lucky Charms or drinking Kool-Aid, and they'd beg me to buy those things. I'd try to tell them about traditional Hopi foods, but I was fighting against every message they were getting from the outside world. It was exhausting. Sometimes I'd give in just to have peace in the house." The health consequences of these dietary changes were already becoming apparent by the 1970s. Rates of diabetes, obesity, and heart disease were climbing dramatically in Native American communities. These diseases had been virtually unknown before contact with Europeans, but by the mid-20th century, they were epidemic. The shift from traditional diets high in protein, fiber, and complex carbohydrates, low in sugar and processed foods, to modern diets based on commodity foods and fast food was literally killing people. But this knowledge came slowly, and the solutions were complex. Even when people understood that traditional foods were healthier, access was the problem. You couldn't just decide to eat more salmon if there was no salmon. You couldn't eat more buffalo if buffalo were extinct. You couldn't gather traditional plants if the land where they grew was now privately owned or had been developed. Some individuals and communities began working to address these challenges in the 70s, though it would take decades to see significant results. Buffalo restoration projects began on several reservations, starting with small herds that would eventually grow. Traditional food programs were established in some communities, teaching young people about their food heritage. Gardens were planted using traditional methods and seed varieties. Emma White Eagle, who we met at the beginning of this story teaching her daughter to make fry bread, was part of this movement. After years of relying primarily on commodity foods, she decided in the late 1970s to reconnect with traditional Lakota food practices. She sought out elders who still knew the old ways. She learned to identify and gather traditional plants. She saved seeds and planted a garden. She taught classes in traditional food preparation at the tribal community center. "It started with that fry bread," she explained years later. "Teaching my daughter to make it made me realize how much we'd lost." Fry bread isn't even traditional. Not really, it's survival food from the reservation era. But if we couldn't even pass down that recent tradition, what chance did the truly old traditions have? So I started learning everything I could. Not because I thought we could go back to living exactly as our ancestors did, that's impossible and probably not even desirable, but because we needed to know who we were. And you can't know who you are if you don't know what your people ate, how they prepared it, why it mattered. By the end of the 1970s, Native American kitchens were spaces of profound transition. The old ways hadn't completely disappeared, but they had been severely diminished. The new ways, commodity foods, fast food, convenience cooking, had taken hold but hadn't fully replaced the traditional. What existed was a hybrid, a compromise, a survival strategy. In some kitchens, you might find a cast iron skillet, seasoned by generations alongside a microwave oven, traditional pottery stored on shelves near Tupperware containers, dried corn hanging from rafters while the freezer held frozen pizzas, grandmothers who could remember when every meal came from the land, teaching grandchildren who thought food came from the supermarket. This wasn't traditional, but it wasn't entirely modern either. It was something in between, something distinctly Native American, in the 1,970 seconds, neither wholly of the past nor wholly of the present. These kitchens held stories of loss and resistance, of survival and adaptation, of cultural death and cultural persistence. In every pot of commodity stew, in every piece of fry bread, in every jar of wild berries gathered from increasingly rare traditional sites, there was a story about what it meant to be Native American in a country that had spent centuries trying to erase Native identity but had never quite succeeded. The women who presided over these kitchens in the 1,970 seconds were warriors in their own way, fighting a battle to preserve something precious while adapting to forces they couldn't control. They were the bridge between generations, between worlds, between what was and what might be. And in the end, that's what Native American food culture in the 1,970 seconds was, a bridge across a chasm, holding together even as the forces of history tried to tear it apart.